Hi, I'm Ashley Cooley, a birth, baby, and sleep specialist and mom of three. There's so much information out there, right? This show is dedicated to helping you clear out the noise so you can figure out what will work best for your baby and your family. If you're looking to learn more about your baby, gain more confidence in your parenting, and get as much sleep as you can through it all, you've come to the right place. Bringing up baby is about to get a little easier. Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Ashley Cooley. I'm the owner of Birth Baby Sleep. And what a conversation I have for you today. I got to chat with Dr. Drew Weatherhead, who's an associate professor at Dalhousie University, and we got into a conversation around language development for babies and young children. This is just so fascinating. I've never actually took the time to sit and think about, okay, so how are they learning these languages? Do they really hear things in the womb, and can they recognize those sounds outside of the womb? I found it really common when my girls were little and they were learning languages that people would say oh, they speak so well. Oh, my little guy doesn't have all those words just yet, but I hear boys develop more slowly than girls with their language. So I asked Dr. Weatherhead about that. We also talked about different languages. So if your little one is learning a second language, if they're bilingual and you're bilingual in the home, does that have an impact positively or negatively on their language development? How does that all really play out? So there's so many little details and nuggets of information that I was just like, oh my gosh, that's wow, incredible. And so while we don't have our podcast up on YouTube, there were a lot of whoa moments that you might hear reflected back as you're listening. But all that being said, I do want to introduce you to Dr. Weatherhead. Like I said, she's an associate professor at Dalhousie University, and she specializes in early childhood language and social cognitive development. Her research focuses on infants and young children, how they learn to communicate, understand others, and navigate the social world. She works closely with families to better understand how language skills develop in everyday contexts, with the goal of using research to support healthy development in an increasingly diverse world. So while Dr. Weatherhead and her team at Dalhousie University have several studies going on, so we link to all of the links to that and to find out more in our show notes, so please check that out. And I really, I just want to strongly encourage anyone who's maybe interested in this or just wants to participate in the study to go out and do so, because research like this is so important when it comes to developing policies, recommendations, working with families, on at the ground level, right? So we need to learn more about these things to inform our professionals that then trickle down to help families. So research is kind of near and dear to my heart, and I think it's really important. So if anyone is interested in helping out with the research and participating, there are in-person as well as virtual options. Dr. Weatherhead even kind of broke down a little bit about how they do their research and what it's like for them and for the babies and the little kids. So you get to just get a better picture of what you may be able to expect. But such a wonderful team, such great research, such important information. And so we're going to dive into it a little bit right now. So without further ado, here's Dr. Drew Weatherhead and our conversation from earlier today to chat about language development with your little ones. Hi, Drew. It's so nice to see you. I'd really love if we could start this conversation by you sharing a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, so I am a associate professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience here at Dalhousie. My main interest is in language development, specifically, early lexical development. So when I say lexical, I'm referring to words specifically. So how do babies learn words? How do they know what words when they're learning a new word form, like for example, dog, how do they know what that maps onto in their environment? And then also I'm interested in, kind of the social component. So what if they hear these words in an accent they're not familiar with? What if they're learning these words or hearing these words from people they don't have experience with before, and how that might affect that, word processing, I guess.
That's so interesting. I mean, I have three girls, so and they're all talking now.
Yeah.
They're older, but I never really considered like how that all really works. Like you're just like, oh, by this time they should be saying this many words, and they're just picking up on things quickly, sort of after that.
Hmm.
But I've never really thought about the intricacies about how they're learning the language, especially like you said, if there's different cultures or accents or maybe bilingual, trilingual families. So I'm excited to dive into this and just learn more about what you're doing and researching. So, what how do babies learn to speak? Let's start there. Like what's going on in their little brains? Because I love trying to figure out what's going on in there. For how does that all kind of come together for them?
So it is a long and
I'm
complicated
sure that's why you
process.
study it all, but if there's any kind of simplification of it, I'd love
Yeah,
to
I mean,
know.
so we can start from like the very beginning if we want. Like,
Yeah,
so
like in
babies
the
are
womb.
already paying attention while they're in the womb. They're already learning things
I love
about
that.
language. So they come into the world already having like certain preferences. So, when they're in the womb, obviously they can't hear necessarily like sounds because, the different layers of, um,
Yeah.
the body are kind of, muffling that sound to a certain degree. But what they're really hearing at that point is more like what we call prosodic information. So you can just think of that as like rhythm, like
Mm,
no,
okay.
no, 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 no. Like how does the language, what is the rhythm of the language?
Is that
So
why people say that when babies are in the womb that they like to listen to music? Have you heard that?
exactly,
Yeah, because it's the
yes,
rhythm of it. Okay.
exactly. So they're paying attention to who's saying it. So the person they can really understand is the mother. So when they come out, actually, within the first 2 days, we can, do studies with them, and I can explain how we do that. It's interesting, but
Mm,
they'll um, they'll already prefer their mother's voice right upon being born. And
yeah,
they'll
that's so
also
cool.
remember things they heard too. So if you read a particular story or played a particular song, they'll recognize that when they come out.
Whoa.
I
And do you
know.
do you notice that by just like would they maybe get calm? Like sometimes we hear like babies or kids are like, "Oh, when this certain song comes on, they're like super
Yes.
chill."
So that's actually, yes, that's one of the ways we can do it. So we can use physiological measures. So that'd be looking at things like heart rate and things like that. So yes, they do
Mm,
tend to get more calm when they're hearing something familiar or something that they like.
mm.
The other thing we can do is something called high amplitude sucking. So we put almost like a soother it's set up to a machine that can measure kind of how strong and how consistently
Wow.
they're sucking to something. So we can almost train them by doing that so that they'll suck kind of harder and longer to things that they're interested in and less to
Oh.
things that they're not interested in. So if they hear their mom's voice, they'll actually suck harder on this soother and for longer.
Oh my gosh, that is wild. That's so
I know. I've
interesting.
never done one of those studies. I would love to do a high amplitude sucking because it's so
Oh,
cool.
wow, I want to be involved. No, that's really cool. Yeah, I think it's just so incredible how like these little things, like how do we even figure that out that oh, they're sucking differently when they're anyway, I could get all into the research stuff
Methods is my
side of
favorite thing
it.
to talk
The
about.
methods
If you
are
ask my
pretty.
students, there's maybe too much methods in my classes, according to them. But
Oh, well, hey, you got to have different ways of doing things. So that's okay. That's really cool. So it starts in the womb, and I come from the world of health promotion where we're all about prevention. So to me, I'm
Mhm.
thinking like, wow, we can like find those particular songs or rhythms or words or noises or what have you while they're in the womb and go back to those when we're needing help to settle them and comfort
Yeah,
them
no,
because
that's
they're
a
going to
really
be
good
more
point.
familiar. That's
Hmm.
awesome. Cool. Okay, so why is it even important to know about this stuff? Like I'm personally interested, and I think as we go along and some of the questions that I'll ask, we'll get more deeper into this. But I'm just curious, like you created, like this is your life, this is your
Hmm.
passion to work with families and learn these things and do the research in this area. So why is it important to know about how babies are learning language and forming all of that?
Hmm. So, the thing that really interested me in this topic, so I actually come from a computer science background, and I was really interested in like modeling language back before like Alexa was even a thing. This is what I was
Okay,
interested in is this possible? How do we do that? And I
cool.
remember, thinking, okay, well, we need to kind of understand how babies do this in the first place. And I kind of just assumed this was something we knew.
Hmm.
And I was shocked by how little we actually know about that process. So, how do we go from this kind of, blank slate of no words, not recognizing any words, to being able to, speak full sentences, becoming masters of our language? And to me, my concern is if we don't understand the process of how that actually works in children,
Mm,
then there's no way to really set up interventions for that, right? So if we don't know how that process is happening, then we can't really intervene. We don't know at the right time and how to intervene kind of appropriately.
mm,
So I don't personally do the intervention work, but I'm interested in learning about these processes so that we know kind of what's happening and at what time, so that the people who do that intervention work can then look at that and say, okay, here's like a good point in time to intervene.
mm, mm.
And here's the
Okay.
right kind of thing to do.
Yeah. Oh, that makes a ton of sense. I I have so many questions. I'm even just thinking about when I was in Costco the other day. I was literally thinking about this, and not having to do with our conversation at all, but I hear a mom speaking to her little one who's definitely under a year of age,
Mhm,
and in another language.
mhm.
And I just start thinking about, and I have friends too that maybe are speaking French to their little ones, or again, another language. And I'm so curious of like, okay, so if they're potentially this baby's maybe getting a lot of another language at home.
Mhm,
But then when you're out in Halifax here, like
mhm.
we're hearing mostly English. So how does that all talk to me
Yeah,
about, I really want to jump into these other languages that babies are sometimes learning all at the same
yeah,
time, and how does that affect how their primary language? Are they behind in that? Like what does that look like?
definitely. Yeah, so I think a lot of people are concerned about this, and unfortunately, there is a lot of misinformation out there about this topic. So historically what happened, I'll kind of give you a historical context for why this
Sure.
misinformation exists and then what the reality is. So historically, kind of what would happen when people were studying language development is they would take a bilingual and they would measure these language milestones, like things like vocabulary, for example, in English or in, kind of the dominant language in that society.
Mm,
And what they would find is that bilingual babies have a smaller vocabulary than monolingual babies. And the takeaway would be like, well, bilinguals are delayed. Bilingualism is harmful to your child's development. You should, have your child learn the first language first and then like introduce that second language later because it's confusing them. And this
mm,
was kind of the narrative that was out there. This was recommendations that doctors would give. And again, this is why it's so important that we understand how things are working because this does influence the advice that we're giving to parents.
yeah.
Um, but then people started to look at bilinguals a little more holistically. So back to the example of vocabulary. So if we measure, say, a Spanish English bilingual's vocabulary in English, yes, their vocabulary might be smaller than a baby who's only learning English.
Hmm.
But if you look at their Spanish vocabulary as well, the combined vocabulary is right about at the same level as a monolingual. Sometimes we even see the bilinguals have more words. They're
Wow.
just spread across two languages. And for all the different milestones, no matter what part we're looking at, if we're looking at how they learn sounds, words, grammar, all of that, if you look at a bilingual in one individual language, they might be a little bit behind in those milestones. It might hit a little bit later. Um, but they are having to learn two things at once, right? So
Hmm. Hmm.
that makes sense because they need that extra time with both the languages to be able to get to the same place. So, if they're hearing both languages 50-50, then they only have 50% of the experience that a monolingual has in that language. So it's not that they're delayed, they're just getting a little less information right now.
Hmm.
And then, typically by the time we see them entering like school, all those differences have kind of washed out. There's
Hmm.
no real difference. So my advice is always multiple languages are good. We see not only social benefits, but there are other types of benefits we can see from bilingualism as well. And introducing those languages as early as possible is actually going to be better in the long run.
Amazing. Would that be the same if there's more than two languages going on? If there's, say,
Yeah.
three or even four? Is that
So
still
I
the
will
same?
say there is less work on, it's hard to find a good sample of
I'm
trilinguals
sure.
and
Yeah.
multilinguals. So there is less work. It does seem to be the same kind of thing, but again, if you're now hearing three languages, we might see milestones hitting even slightly later. But I will say, from my knowledge, there's not a lot of work with trilingual, so I'm not quite as confident talking about
Mm,
that as opposed to bilinguals. But again, in North America, I feel like we have a very kind of, monolingual is kind of the dominant, but in many, many places in the world, people speak,
many
many
languages.
languages,
Yeah.
4 or 5. So
Yeah.
it's not an unusual experience.
Wow. It's just so incredible that their brains, while still forming, are so capable of these kinds of and I from what I understand, it's easier for babies or children to pick up new languages. Is that right?
Yeah, so we have what we call critical periods. So a critical period is when you kind of need you need a certain amount of information in this window for you to kind of fully pick things up in the kind of a native speaking kind of way.
Hmm.
So we think there might be a critical period for first language acquisition. So you would need information from your first language kind of before the age of 7 to develop, a first language
Hmm.
appropriately. And there's another kind of critical period, although I would say this is more of a sensitive period. It's a little more controversial, but they say kind of before 18, but obviously the earlier, the better with picking.
I'm surprised by these ages. It's a lot
I
later than
know.
I would have thought, but that's interesting.
Kids are very resilient.
Mm,
They are very resilient. So they can recover,
I love
in the
that.
absence of information. Like a good example is so children who are deaf, born to speaking parents.
Oh.
So um, for example, this is a really my students love hearing about this, but in Nicaragua, for example, in the 90s, there was no school for the deaf. So basically, children who were born deaf and in these hearing families, they really didn't have any access to language, right? So they'd kind of make these makeshift languages in their home where they would kind of make their own home signs, but it wasn't really fully fledged like a language would be.
Hmm.
Um, but then they opened a school for the deaf, but it was supposed to be more like lip reading. It was supposed to be very still focused on speaking.
Hmm.
But what actually ended up happening is the children developed their own language, their own sign language, Nicaraguan sign language.
Wow.
So just by being with each other and kind of very rapidly, they were able to develop their own sign language. And what was interesting is every cohort that came in kind of improved on that language and made it more language-like.
Wow.
So they
Wow.
say language change in general is driven by children.
Wow, incredible. So that actually brings up another question for me. What do they already know about language? Like, do they know words? I mean, again, I've seen my girls grow up and
Hmm.
you can tell there's definitely phases where they're trying to say something they want to communicate with you, but they're frustrated and
Hmm.
then it just gets harder. So talk to me about that. Do
Yeah.
they already have like a set of words that they're just like, okay, I got to figure out how to speak it, or how does that work?
Yeah. So, okay, this is the area that I'm most interested in. Like, once they start talking, I kind of lose interest. I'm not gonna lie.
You can go now.
I'm interested in kind of what they understand, and especially before they're able to speak. So, when they're first born, they're not necessarily like coming in, there's obviously probably heard like nature versus nurture is kind of
Yeah.
yeah. So there are some disagreements about, what exactly babies come into the world knowing about language. I think kind of the prevailing thought right now is it's a bit of both, where I think babies are definitely coming into the world like predisposed to be interested in language. They prefer to listen to language over other kind of non-communicative signals. And they show this very early preference for just hearing language, seeing human faces, and so on. So they're kind of predisposed to learn it, but I don't think they necessarily have any of the information already. So I think over the first year of life, they're really trying to pick up this information. And this is
Mm,
kind of when I think the most is happening in terms of language development. So there's a couple things that need to happen. First, they need to understand the sounds that are relevant to their language.
mhm.
So I'll try not to get too technical with this, but I'll teach you a word. It's called a phoneme. So a
Okay.
phoneme is just the smallest unit of speech that if you changed it, it would change the meaning of a word. So I'll give you an example. Pa versus ba is a very important distinction in English, right? Because the difference between pat and bat would mean different things to us.
Mm-hmm.
So pa and ba are two important sounds that we need to learn as English learners. Um, so what's interesting is there are a lot of different sounds that we could potentially hear, and it's a little bit arbitrary which ones are important. So it really depends on the language that you're learning. So different languages might have different phonemes. So for example, in Japanese language, the difference between like and l doesn't exist for them. That kind of maps on to the same thing. So that's why
Mm.
sometimes if you hear someone who is a Japanese speaker who learns English later in life, they kind of struggle to pronounce those ers and uls. And that's
Oh,
because they
okay.
actually have a hard time hearing the difference because that's not a meaningful difference in their language. Uh,
Oh, wow.
I
Okay.
know. I think this is a thing that it really blew my mind when I first like learned this because it's like, oh, okay, I guess sounds are somewhat arbitrary and what's happening, what's really cool is in the first year of life, babies can kind of hear all these different sounds and they're paying attention to all of them. But in that first year, they start to focus on the sounds that are specific to their native language. So the language that they're hearing. And for bilinguals, they would be paying attention to the sounds that are existing in both the languages they're hearing.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is, say a Japanese baby will hear the difference between r and l early on, say at like 4 months. But
Mm-hmm.
by the time they get to be around like 10 months, all of a sudden they don't hear the difference between that anymore.
Wow.
So that's the first thing we're doing is kind of narrowing in on the sounds that we need to learn.
Hmm.
And then the next thing we need to do is start trying to find words. And this, I think, is a much harder task than people realize. So if you listen to me talk right now, I don't pause between every
Right.
word, right?
Right.
So it's like I think for adults, the example I always give is when you're listening to a new song and you're trying to figure out the lyrics, and it can be really hard to tell what the
Yeah.
person is saying.
Yeah,
That's
totally.
basically what babies are doing, right? Because they don't know any words. They're just hearing this continuous stream of speech. So how do they know where one word starts and another
Oh my
begins?
gosh, totally. I
I
never
know.
thought, I would
So
never think of this. That's so
I
cool.
know we call it like a sea of sound. So it's like basically just like unlimited sounds. And what they need to do is start figuring out, how these sounds go together. So what they need is an anchor, and an anchor is just a word. So if they know a word, then they can start to split the sentence into different parts. So like let's say they know the word baby, and now I'm putting myself on the spot to think of a sentence that has baby in it, but like maybe I say something like, "Oh, the baby's so cute. Isn't the baby pretty?" So if they know the word baby, they can start to chunk that sentence in everything that happened before baby and everything that happened after baby, right?
Okay.
Yeah, I know that
I
gets a
think
little,
I'm confused.
I
Poor babies.
know. It's
No,
like
but I kind of get it. Yeah.
yeah, it's like they need something that they can pick out. So if they know a word, then they can start to at least pick that out from the sentence and then split the
Right.
sentence into kind of more manageable pieces that they can then focus on.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So
Yeah.
the first anchor, the first word that a baby understands is their own name.
Really?
Yes.
I would
So
have thought it would be like mama, dada, like
no,
because
it's their
that's what we
own
often hear
name.
them say. It's their own name. Love
Yeah.
it.
So
Love
they
it.
know their own name by about 4.5 months.
Wow.
I know.
Wow. Oh
So
my
they hear
gosh.
it a lot. And I think it's a word that they hear a lot in isolation.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily happening in a continuous stream, or it's happening kind of at the end of the sentence or a beginning of a sentence. So I think it's just a very salient
Mm.
word to them.
Mm.
So by the time they're about 6 months, they can use their name as an anchor. So if they hear their name in a sentence, they prefer to listen to that sentence over one that doesn't have their name. And what that means is they can start to chunk the sentence then and start trying to pick out some other words.
Oh, that makes sense. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Man, the
But
brain's
mommy and daddy
amazing.
are very early words. So mommy, daddy, hand, foot, and then like select food items that they might like banana juice, that kind of thing,
So
at
would
around
that be
6 months.
something that they're, yeah, so that could that be something they're hearing a lot of around the time that they are. So did
Yeah,
you say 6 months is
yeah,
around that time when that might start?
yeah,
So naturally foods, if you're
yeah, exactly.
like
Once the foods
that
start
makes
getting
sense.
introduced, and um,
Okay.
yeah, I think things that they're going to hear a lot are going to be the things that they would start to pick out. And again, it kind of depends on where the words are showing up in a sentence too. So one thing we find is that babies tend to learn nouns much earlier than like verbs, adjectives, things like that. And that's because nouns tend to be at the end of a sentence. So
Right.
it's easier for
Right.
them to kind of pick that out.
Or
And
we're
we
saying like, look, there's Grammy or there's Daddy,
exactly.
and you're
You'll
being very
repeat it
specific.
more.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay. Any difference boys versus girls? Because what I hear is at around 18 months, usually we have a doctor's appointment. They're maybe getting vaccines where they're asking like, how many words does your little one have?
hmm
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is it 20 words or something in that vicinity that they're looking for? And maybe this is beyond because like you're looking at the learning
Yeah, I'm
part of
not
it,
sure what the
but
exact miles, like the number that they would expect at that exact, that sounds about right to
yeah.
me. But
But
again,
is
children vary
there
so much.
well, if we rewind and going back to the development with language, do we notice anything difference with gender? Is that something that you differentiate between or
No, not to my knowledge.
okay.
There might be differences maybe later in terms of like the types of words they're being exposed to and things like that. But in terms of development, we don't really see any differences like in terms of like say vocabulary development between boys and girls. We do see some differences in, for example, like birth order. So
Oh, okay.
oldest children do tend to have more words at a particular age than, say, a youngest child.
Because the youngest
Uh,
can get the older one to speak for them.
yeah,
And so
exactly.
honestly, I can't tell you how many times where I'd say my oldest is she's 5 years older than my youngest.
Yeah.
And so when she was a baby and just learning words and stuff, I'd be like, Stella, what's she trying to say? Like, I don't know. And she would tell me it was so helpful.
I know. I feel like that was the same difference between me and my brother. And it's like he would talk in gibberish and I would just translate to everyone.
Oh, well, it makes sense that you're doing the work that you do now.
Yeah.
Here's another question. I really hate to bring up the C word, but how did COVID change things in language and learning that? Because when I was thinking about that with babies and
hmm
you're constantly seeing people with a mask on, so you're not getting
hmm
like the facial expressions and stuff, how
Yeah.
important is that with language development?
Yeah. So, I mean, there were definitely effects of COVID across all different types of development, like not just in the language domain in terms of
Yeah,
social development, like general cognitive development, and so on. So, definitely seeing effects across the board. And some of those we're still seeing even, later on now too. So, it's definitely, it changed things. What's interesting is, it seems to affect certain populations maybe more than it affected others, which is unfortunate. So, a lot of the work that's kind of coming out about that now, because a lot of people started studying it when COVID started and then
I'm
are now
sure.
publishing
Yeah.
that work now. So, we're kind of, really starting to see the results from this. And it does seem like, the higher socioeconomic status families maybe weren't very affected by this because they maybe still had the time to spend, reading and talking to their children. And in some of these cases, we've seen that these children actually had improved language development because they were getting more one-on-one time, getting
Mm,
more language
hmm
exposure.
hmm
And then unfortunately, families who maybe fell into a lower socioeconomic status, potentially it was a more stressful situation for those parents. They might not have been able to, provide the same level of stimulation and same level of, language experience to their children during that time. So we see those children might have been more affected. And obviously there's exceptions to each group because it's
Sure.
not necessarily about the socioeconomic status. It's about the kind of circumstances and how that affects the experience that those children are having.
Mm,
Mhm.
right. Yeah. Because I guess, some parents would have been at home a lot more with their
Exactly.
children, and others might have been away, like healthcare workers,
Exactly.
just all of those things. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about baby talk? So, should we be talking to our babies like, oh, it's so cute, a little baby, and
Yeah.
like, that kind of
Yeah.
mother ease, the baby talk kind of thing? Or should we be speaking to them like, maybe not like they're an adult, but like
Mhm.
speaking to, does the way we talk to babies have an effect on any of this?
So this is again, I think maybe like beside bilingualism and this topic are the two that I think have the most misinformation out
Wow. Okay.
there. So baby talk is actually really, really, really good for your kid.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
If you're talking with that kind of infant directed, mother ease speech, that is actually helping your baby learn language. So keep doing it. And if you've been
Okay.
on the fence about it, do it because it helps.
All right. All
And
right.
It
More
makes
so than
sense.
speaking to them in a neutral tone and that
hmm
kind of thing. Okay.
So one thing we see right away from birth is that babies prefer to listen to this infant directed speech. So if they hear sentences that are like, "Hi baby, how are you?" versus "Hi baby, how are you?" They like to
Same for
listen to the
me.
former.
Same for me.
And I mean, the first thing right off the bat is it's going to attract their attention more. It's more interesting.
Mhm.
But from a learning perspective, it's actually helping for a couple different reasons. So the first thing when we do baby talk, we tend to have more pitch variation. So it's like, "Hi, baby."
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
so that's
Mhm.
actually, helping with things like not only the attention, but also helping them kind of, they're trying to learn the sounds in their language. So that's actually helping them kind of narrow in more on what the individual sounds are.
Mm.
And then we tend to talk slower, which, if they're trying to find words in the sea of sound that we talked about before, it's easier to do that if there's a lot more pauses and
Mm. Mhm.
it's a lot more obvious where one word is starting and one word's beginning. Um, and yeah, so babies across the board prefer to listen to infant-directed speech. So not every culture necessarily uses infant-directed speech. So there are some cultures where they do talk to their baby as if they're adults. And
Mhm.
those babies still learn language. So if you really want to talk to your kid like they're an adult, that's fine. But what we do see is that they do tend to be kind of further behind in milestones, which again, I think everything kind of comes out in the wash in the end. So being behind at a particular milestone doesn't mean you're going to be behind forever.
Yeah.
But we do see, like lower vocabularies at certain ages than those societies where they're getting that infant directed speech.
Mm.
And what's interesting is babies will prefer infant directed speech even if it's not in their native language. So if it's in another language, they'll prefer it. And even, babies that can hear, they'll prefer to watch infant directed sign. So people who do sign language, they also do this kind of exaggerated speech with their
Mm.
signs when they talk to babies. So even hearing babies will prefer to look at infant directed signs than adult directed signs. So uh,
Ah,
something
wow.
they're looking for very early.
Yeah. Well, like you said, it would be more interesting for
hmm
them just with the sounds and how they're doing that. Very,
hmm
very cool. So, well, listen, are you doing any studies right now in this avenue? I know that's part of what you're doing as an associate professor at Dal. So what are those looking like?
Yeah, so we have a number of studies going on right now that range anywhere from, 11 months up until 8 years old. So, we've got something kind of for everyone right now. And we also have studies that are both in person and we also have studies that are online,
Oh,
which are
great.
virtual studies. So, if you live a little bit out of town and you're not sure if you can make it into Dalhousie to do a study, there still are opportunities to participate if you're interested. So, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of my work is kind of looking more at this kind of social component of language. How do children contend with, accents and how do they, if they're seeing people from different cultures that they haven't experienced before, does that influence the way that they, process language or process words? So a lot of our studies kind of focus on this. So I think I'll highlight maybe one of our studies that's kind of newer and is happening in the lab right now. So we are looking at infants' recognition of familiar words. So these are, 11, 12, 13-month old. So,
Hmm.
looking at the receptive vocabulary. So this would be words very, very familiar to them, like bottle.
Hmm.
So we're using neuroimaging to see kind of what parts of the brain are active when they hear words that they know versus words that they
Mm.
don't know.
Mm.
So we use a very non-invasive technique. It's called functional near-infrared spectroscopy. And basically it
Say
just,
what now?
I
How do
know,
you repeat that?
ignore that. Call it FNIRS.
Okay,
It
okay.
it uses red light basically to detect oxygenation changes in the brain.
Mm.
So it's the same kind of thing you'd have on like a smartwatch measuring your heart rate. So these little lights, they're in a cap that we put on the baby's head. And basically, if an area of the brain is being used, blood is going to go there.
Mm.
So then these sensors can detect, okay, this part of the brain is active right now when they're hearing this type of thing, and
So
maybe not
cool.
active during another type of word. Uh,
Yeah.
so we're looking at, what they think about or how, the brain reacts to these familiar words versus unfamiliar words. And then we're also looking at what they do if those familiar words are now presented with an accent. So if they, instead of hearing bottle, all of a sudden hear bettle, does the brain still react the same to that word, or are they treating it like a word they've never seen before? So
Ooh.
that's one of the studies we're doing right now. Again, we have some virtual studies. We have a virtual study for babies that they can do online at home. So I think that is, I'm trying to remember the exact age range, but I think it's between like 16 to 22 months. In
Okay.
that one, we're looking more at babies' metalinguistic expectations. So metalinguistics is exactly like it sounds, like meta, like what do they think about language?
Oh
Um,
my gosh.
I
Oh
know.
my gosh. How do you even go there? Wow.
I know. So it's there's this really funny kind of finding that has perplexed me for years, where they found that basically monolingual babies think that new people are monolingual. So a monolingual baby is surprised if you're talking in English and all of a sudden you start speaking French, they are surprised by this. They are not
Mm,
expecting that. So they kind of just assume everyone has the same experience as them. Whereas bilinguals don't have that same experience. So they don't expect, they're not surprised if someone speaks a second language. Um, but, I wanted to kind of put this sociolinguistic twist on it because a lot of the studies that have been done just in general, there's usually not, any information about what the person looks like. And I think we always need to be paying attention to the social context that babies are learning language as well, because what's happening in most cases, babies are growing up in a monoracial household.
mhm,
So usually, I think interracial marriages actually account for less than like 10% of marriages in Canada, which is wild because I would assume much more. So
mm,
most babies are learning language in an environment where they're hearing words said in a very specific way, and they're seeing it from people who look a very specific way too.
mm,
So babies might have expectations about the language, but it might also be just within the context of people who look like them. So a lot of my
mm,
work has kind of looked at this, and what I find is that in general, babies seem to have very specific expectations about people who are from a familiar race. So if it's, for example, a white baby growing up in a white household, if they see a new white speaker, they're going to assume that this person should use words in the same way as the people that they're used to. So
mhm,
if, say, if someone from a familiar race says the word battle, they think
mm,
that's a new word. They don't think that's bottle because if you are using the same conventions as the people I'm learning from, you should say bottle. But they don't have those same expectations for people from an unfamiliar race. So if they encounter someone that they don't have experience with, and this person says battle, they actually do think it means bottle. So they're way more willing to accept. So yeah, I know this.
Jeez.
I know. And
Wow.
what's interesting is babies don't assume that people who look different are necessarily going to be different. So they still kind of go into the interaction kind of looking to learn about this person. And if they find out this person, talks similarly to the people that they're used to, then they will then apply those same conventions. But they're way more flexible in the way that they're, thinking about how this person might say language.
Oh
Um,
my gosh.
I
That
know. So
I just think it's so incredible that we can really like almost get into the minds of babies and like what are they thinking or how are they
yeah.
processing? So wild. That's
My job
wild.
is really fun.
That's so
It's really
cool.
fun. But yeah,
Um,
so that study is kind of looking at that. So if we change the face, does that change their expectations about the number of languages that people can speak? So that's what that study is looking at.
wow.
And then
Wow.
we just have a lot of study for preschoolers. We tend to look at, just like their accent processing in general, like how they might learn a new accent. We have studies that are more general, like looking at like what they think about people who have accents. Um, what they think about like diversity in general. Like, do they prefer, to interact with groups that are diverse versus homogenous? And, how can we maybe change the way they think about that?
Mm,
So lots of different topics, and it kind of depends when you sign up, what's going
mm.
to be available. But we do have studies kind of always running in these age groups. So
Okay.
10 months to like 8 to 10 years, there's usually something.
Okay, cool. Well, I my youngest is fits in that category, so maybe I'll sign her up for
Okay,
something.
yes, please.
And while I have I don't have a PhD, but I have a master's degree. I'm pretty well versed in the area of research, and I totally understand how important it is because as you're saying, like the research that you're doing can help inform those who are working with little ones and
Mhm.
what how they can troubleshoot something or how they can just work with them on things. So what incentivizing those to come out and I mean, we're no, there's never any pressure to do a study, but
No,
you know,
no.
it can be so easy for someone to think, oh, yeah, that's cool, and let's carry on. But why
Hmm.
might somebody want to participate in this other than obviously just helping to
Hmm.
inform your research?
Yeah. So we do try to make the process as enjoyable as possible for the children. So they do get prizes and things like that. And especially for the older kids, we really tend to gamify things. So, they're earning superstars and they're, getting coloring pages. And, we have a lot of kids who at the end are like, okay, can I do another one now?
You're not
So
going to like a lab where it's just all empty and quiet and dark and
no,
like,
it's
here,
very
put this
cute. My
on.
lab is
Yeah, yeah.
very cute.
Okay.
So lots of toys, lots of things to play with. If they're doing a virtual study, the kids, for example, they're meeting, with one of my research assistants, and it's very much like a conversation. At the end of the day, we want the kids to have fun. So all my research assistants are trained to kind of notice the signs. If a kid is not enjoying it, we're not going to force them to finish
Right.
it. They always have autonomy to leave if they're not enjoying it.
Okay.
That's not happened, but if that was the case, that's definitely, okay, and not something that they would need to worry about. But yeah, like so, they always get a prize. We always try to make it as fun as possible. For the younger kids, the babies, it kind of depends. If it's an online study, usually, the parents can just kind of do it when there's a good time because they just have to sit in front of their computer and they just watch a short video. It takes about, 10 minutes, not even to do the whole thing. So
Okay. Okay.
it's not going to be a huge inconvenience. And, if they come into Dalhousie, again, we do try to make sure the child is, warmed up first. And, it can be scary going to a new place, period, when you're a baby, especially,
Yeah.
when parents are still on mat leave, the baby's not necessarily going a lot of places on a regular basis. So a new place can be kind of scary. So my
Mm-hmm.
research assistants are trained to make sure the baby's comfortable, make sure the parents are comfortable. Again, making sure that at the end the baby gets a prize, and of course,
Nice.
any cost that's incurred, like parking, gas, things like that, are all covered as well.
Amazing. This is totally unrelated. Well, maybe not totally, but I was at a store the other day, yesterday actually, and it's a place where you can have passport photos done.
Mm.
And this family had a young girl, very young, that was
Mhm.
trying. Anyone who's gotten a passport photo
Yeah.
for their little one knows it doesn't always go well. And the gentleman, he was like a young man. Like, and it didn't seem like old enough maybe to have kids. I mean, maybe, I don't know. I shouldn't assume.
Mhm.
But I could tell with the interaction. And he's just like, hey, smile for your mom. And and this baby was not having it. And I
Yeah.
just kind of wanted to go over there and be like, if you could be a little more like, hey,
Yeah.
right? But
Yes.
it wasn't my place. But
Hmm.
that is so important that again, we're not just when we think sometimes I think people might
Hmm.
think research study, okay, it's a lab, it's just a different
Yeah.
scene and they're going to have like
Hmm.
monitors on them. Who's going to really do
Yeah.
it? But like you guys sounds like you really make it fun and it's like an enjoyable
Definitely.
experience, but you get to get some data out of that.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. My research assistants lately, what did they tell me? They said they found to make sure the baby doesn't get fussy when we put the cap on, they've started giving them a toy to play with. They've been kind of troubleshooting, to make sure they're not fussy. But I guess,
Mm,
yeah, the babies will play with a toy while they get the cap kind of on, and then they'll start the video. And we try to make sure the videos are very engaging because we know how boring it is for a baby to sit there and watch the video. So there's also lots of like what we call reward videos where they get to see like, people dancing and like flowers growing and fun stuff that kind of re-stimulates them to the screen. So
oh,
it's
good.
my understanding that, once babies are starting to study, they are usually finishing in a fairly happy happy
Excellent.
way.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, distraction is key. Same thing
Yeah.
when if you ever want to put a little headband or a bow or like something on the head, a
Yeah.
hat in the summertime, you got to distract before you put that on. Oh, that's fantastic. Listen, Drew, thank you so, so much for coming on and sharing all this really cool information and about your study. And hopefully, after we get to put this out and some listeners are also engaged, that maybe they'll contact you to participate. So I will put all your contact info and information and links about those studies in the show notes for people to check out. But are you on social media? Do we have a website? Where can we just direct people quickly?
Yeah, so our socials for Instagram, it's at GCLL Baby Group. And then I don't know the domain to my, but
That's
look for
okay.
GCLL
I will
Baby
link for it, so we'll put it in
and
there.
you'll find the website and
Yeah.
all the information's on the website. And I believe we have a Facebook page as well that you can find us at. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. No, I don't think so.
And you're not, and just again, so people understand, like all of this is anonymous. Like you never be putting anybody's information or
Oh
babies or
gosh,
like
no,
showing
no,
that
ethics
online.
would never,
Ethics would
never allow
never
it.
have that, but I just want
Yeah.
to point that out because I just think sometimes we can be a little like, oh, I
Hmm.
don't need to participate in that. No, nobody needs to.
Hmm.
But man, does this stuff is it's so interesting and it
Hmm.
really does help inform how people are
Hmm.
practicing with
Yeah.
whatever speech language pathology or just even helping parents understand what's
Hmm.
going on with their little one a little bit better. So we
Yeah.
appreciate the work that you do and
Thank
thanks so
you.
much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks.
If you're looking for more information or support along your parenting journey, check out birthbabysleep.ca. That's where you're going to find prenatal classes, postpartum and new baby resources, and sleep support during the childhood years. Lastly, but certainly not least, if you got something out of this episode or our show in general, leaving a rating or a quick review goes a really long way to helping others find us. So please consider leaving one. That's all for now. I'm Ashley Cooley, and we'll see you back here next time.